casual. He's yeah.
Yeah. Wow, this is interesting. There's always changes. All right. Here we are. So we are going to have a really fun stream and conversation here. I'm joined today by Dr. Kornfeld, and we are going to talk about the upcoming FDA Lykos MDMA decision that we hope they pass. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some interesting things around addiction, recovery, the Shulgins, maybe some anti-nuclear conversations, and I think it's going to be fun. So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So where are you joining us from today?
I'm in Mill Valley, California, which is this wonderful little town at the base of Mount Tamalpais, north of San Francisco.
I've never heard it pronounced Tamalpais.
Yeah.
I take the shortcut, Mount Tam.
Right.
So that's great. And thanks for being with us here today. And can you give us a little bit of an idea of your professional background?
Sure. Well, I went to college in the late 60s at Northwestern, and I was in a program where I was sort of automatically admitted to medical school based on some previous applications, and so I was able to flow with the late 60s and not worry too much, and then launched into medical school in the early 1970s. And after medical school, I was looking for an area of medicine that I didn't feel contradicted certain kind of principles of nature, so to speak. And so I ended up in emergency medicine because to me it was a very obvious thing. You fixed what you needed to, and then you had some time off to explore the world and ideas. And then luckily I got sent over to Esalen Institute as a young physician to kind of sow my oats here on the West Coast, having grown up in Chicago. And I spent a month with Stan Groff at that time. And this was prior to him developing holotropic breath work, but he developed it shortly afterwards. And I was very much inspired by Esalen and kind of opened up by the whole experience there. Right when I arrived at Esalen, it was pre-MDMA, and but by the early 1980s, I had become active in the prevention of nuclear war, physicians' movement to prevent nuclear war in particular, and attended a major conference that in 1981 that led to a Nobel Peace Prize for the organization, International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War. And at the same time, Richard Price, who was the co-founder of Esalen, and I became friends, and he really wanted to support my work, and they needed medical help there at Esalen. So every month or so, I would spend a week at Esalen, kind of being the Esalen doctor, and just taking in all of these wonderful workshop leaders and idea people that were there. And it was around that time that I met Rick Doblin in the very early phases of the MAPS organization. And I appreciated what some of the people at Esalen were doing, which was to introduce MDMA very carefully to thought leaders that were coming through Esalen. And around that time, as I mentioned, I became friends with the Shulgins, Alexander Sasa Shulgin and his wife Anne, and they introduced me to their wonderful circle of people who were very interested in MDMA at the time. And it was around that time, too, that there was a movement to prevent the DEA from placing MDMA in Schedule 1, because it was not a scheduled substance during a good chunk of the 1980s. And so I witnessed that process. And around that time, I decided, I was an emergency physician, and I decided to take further specialization in the treatment of addictions, because I felt that was an important area. It was a way to officially study substances that affected the mind, and it led to my career in treating addictions, and particularly treating opiate-like problems, and also treating pain conditions, which sometimes opiates are the only way to modulate them. And although I maintained a strong friendship with the psychedelic community, I focused on another drug that was emerging at the time called buprenorphine, which is this modified opiate that can really stabilize both opiate addiction and chronic pain. So I did quite a bit of work to as an early adopter of buprenorphine. Around the same time, I was in this psychedelic community also, and I was at Esalen, and a donor, a financial donor, suggested that we organize a conference, and gave a relatively small amount of money, but we took it, and it was 1994, 1995. So I co-convened what's called the Pacific Symposia on Psychedelic Drugs at Esalen. And it wasn't necessarily the first generation of conferences at Esalen on the topic. There had been a previous one, but the notable events at our conferences in 94, 95, well, Rick Doblin was included, and actually Robert Jesse was just getting involved in the issue. And Rick Doblin's mentor from Harvard, Mark Kleiman, who was a professor of government and helped Rick get a master's degree and then a PhD in public policy, he teamed up with Bob Jesse, and they asked questions to each other. One of the questions was, could the FDA approve a study that was not aimed at curing the ill, but a study with a psychedelic that was aimed at improving the spiritual health of people who were normal, And Mark, who was this government expert, said, yes, there's nothing to prevent it. So they teamed together and found the people at Hopkins, Roland Griffith, and Bill Richards, and they worked very quietly to create the connections, to work with the government, and that was the first pivotal study that took 10 years plus to enact. Rick Doblin was a little more public, he had the MAPS organization, and then Bob Jesse and Mark Kleiman and Roland, they were working more quietly, within the Hopkins ecosystem, and they pulled off that beautiful study that was eventually published, and which eventually Michael Pollan discovered, and that was part of the sort of the renaissance now that you, Joe, and your generation have succeeded to nurture. So anyway, I covered a lot of different topics, and but that's how I came to do what I do.
Yeah, thanks for that. I love the just length of time you've been here. It's amazing. And
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah,
Thank you for not running away.
right, right.
So let's first talk most directly about the upcoming decision that the FDA is scheduled to make. What was the date? August 11. It's kind of weird
Yes,
that it's a Sunday.
right,
But
right. Yes.
what do you have any kind of expectation about what might happen there?
My instinct is that they're going to figure out a way to kick the can down the road because there's so much pressure on them there's two kinds of pressure. One is there's this old school conservatism that reared its head, this fear of the unknown, fear of change, fear of anything that would rock the boat of the current big pharma psychopharmacology kind of system that we have, and as you probably know, the instrument for that was seemed to be this institute called the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, that a number of months ago was influenced by some naysayers to the MAPS research protocol. And they seem to have a great influence on this particular institute, which is generally considered balanced institute that is funded by insurance companies to sort of really look into is a new drug going to be really economically and medically helpful, or is it just a kind of a Me Too drug that is just going to reap profits for the pharmaceutical industry? So the mission of ICER, as they call it, is a good one, but I believe they became very enamored with the critics of the MAPS research program, and now it's of course, the Lykos therapeutics program.
My understanding is that they primarily work for insurance companies.
Yes.
So it's just worth noting that as
Yes.
well. Like, where are your incentives and who's
Yes.
paying?
Yeah. And there might have been a panic in the insurance industry that, if the FDA approves this, then we're going to be obligated to pay for psychedelic sessions, and that's a new and unknown. We know about paying for drugs, even expensive drugs, but we don't really know this landscape. So it could have been a sort of a fear response of the insurance industry to impending approval. And then the actual pharmacology advisory board of the it's called the Psychopharmacology Drugs Advisory Committee, met in early June. And when they met, there was this momentum that this ICER organization had created of negative publicity around the approval of MDMA. And I believe the committee itself, I don't necessarily think they were intrinsically biased from the start, but I think they took wind. They were affected by these unfavorable wind, so to speak, unfavorable opinions that were circulating because of the ICER efforts. And my sense is a kind of a groupthink started to emerge in this committee. The FDA itself issued a briefing document, which is 82 pages long, and points out some of the potential weaknesses of the studies, but the FDA briefing document did not itself cause the committee, to, in my opinion, to vote against the approval of MDMA. I believe it was a kind of a group think, and I don't think the committee probably really took in the decades-long effort, that MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. I don't think they really took in what led to this application and the true implications of it.
Right. I one thing that has been concerning to me is the advisory committee. People seem to make the assumption that the advisory committee was filled with FDA staffers when it doesn't appear to be the case. It seems to be made up of a number of parties. Do you know anything about that you could share here?
I don't know much personally about the Psychopharmacology Drugs Advisory Committee, except when I wrote my letter to the FDA just about a week and a half ago, I noted that none of them had addiction backgrounds at all. And yet one of the arguments they were making was that if the FDA approved MDMA, it could be an impetus towards the abuse of MDMA, which they presented as a danger to society, potential danger to society, and also that Lykos was faulted for not presenting sufficient data on the abuse potential of MDMA because they didn't list experiences that people had on MDMA that were considered pleasurable or euphoric. And so there was a little misunderstanding between the FDA and Lykos, and that misunderstanding was mentioned in the FDA briefing document, but it wasn't overly emphasized. But the committee, kind of in an echo chamber of the ICER's report, presented this as a huge omission, on the part of Lykos. And in my letter, I explained that the pleasurable experience that many people have, not all, but many people have during an MDMA session in the therapeutic, this in the therapy and the psychotherapy that's part of the MDMA experience, that is then directly linked to reduction of fear response from the traumatic events that led to the PTSD. And then that's linked to insights as to what that might mean to a person's life to kind of let go of a fear response. So that pleasure, euphoria, is so intrinsically linked to the sequence of events that makes MDMA healing that it's very understandable that Lykos would not have pinpointed that as an adverse event leading to abuse So there was this little misunderstanding. The other thing I point out in my letter is that in my like 30 years of experience in treating addictions, of course, I take a history from every patient about what drugs they've used, including psychedelics, including mushrooms, including MDMA. And so I've literally interviewed hundreds, really thousands of patients about their experiences with MDMA. And many of my patients had used MDMA at some point. Sometimes it's a decade or two back in their history. And I pointed out that the abuse or adverse outcomes of the MDMA use was very, very minimal. And I'm dealing with people who've had many adverse effects from opiates, from alcohol, from benzodiazepines. So I'm with a population that is prone, to abuse. And yet when they gave me histories of their use of MDMA, the negative outcomes or the abuse outcomes were very, very minimal. And they also explained to me that, yes, MDMA was fun, but after taking it for a while, it wasn't fun anymore, because there's sort of a built-in nature of MDMA that if you overuse it, then the rewarding parts of the experience diminish, often quite decisively. And so people, if they have an addictive process going on, they're going to move to another drug. They're not going to use MDMA, and that MDMA in very few cases was noted as like a gateway drug to another drug. Usually it just happened to exist in the milieu of people's lives, and often they said, yes, that was actually helpful to me at the time, even when they've had trouble with other drugs before and after that.
Mm. That's really helpful. Yeah, I've certainly done my fair share of MDMA overuse, right? And it's like dramatically dropped off. It wasn't like I needed to work to quit MDMA or anything like that. And I was yeah, I have seen the literature and it does not appear to be as addictive as you would suspect. But yeah, the FDA did, or the advisory committee did have concerns about it being a drug that kind of feels good. And I don't know that they were asking the right questions to further
Right.
your point. Yeah, it just seems like that's the case.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there was this criticism that there was not that the placebo was inactive versus an active placebo. And the ICERS committee really, really highlighted it. And then, in this echo kind of chamber, the Psychopharmacology Drugs Advisory Committee amplified that with very little understanding of the history of that issue, where the FDA and Lykos or MAPS really negotiated and discussed this in great depth with them, and they agreed together to use an inactive placebo. Sometimes an active placebo can be used in some psilocybin work. The drug Ritalin, which is a stimulant like an amphetamine-like stimulant, can be used. But there was some serious concern that in this traumatized population, if you gave them an inactive or an active placebo that was in a way like almost like a toxic placebo, you might be harming those individuals. So in a way, it was a safety decision on the part of MAPS and Lykos to use an inactive placebo. And again, the FDA had some concerns but agreed with it. And it was like all of a sudden moving the goalpost, to a whole different football field, um, to highlight that as a fatal flaw in these studies. And then the effect size was so great that um, it would have compensated for the lack of an active placebo. And in addition, there were blind raters. There was mechanisms built into the study where the people who rated the surveys um, were not aware of who was placebo and who was an active intervention. So I noted in my letter to the FDA that I personally follow FDA studies very closely because a number of years ago, I decided uh, to read what's called the medical letter. It's one of the few medical publications that's a nonprofit organization and has no advertisements, and it's a very academic group, and they study all the FDA new drug applications and the new drug studies, and they review the FDA studies that lead to, the latest drug for acne even, or the latest drug for some kind of lymphoma. They actually present articles. And I personally decided, like about 5 years ago, that I would get my continuing medical education by studying this letter and taking exams and whatnot. So I run across FDA studies all the time, and there's something called the gold standard, which is a pure double-blind placebo-controlled randomized study, and that's what everybody is working towards. But in psychopharmacology, it's very hard to have a complete double-blind study, because if you give half the people Prozac, in a few days they feel something happening in their body. Sometimes it's a little negative, sometimes it's positive, but people know they're on something. And so it's a universal problem, but these committees presented it like it was a completely careless decision on the part of Lykos that should lead to them to deny approval. So I pointed out this to the FDA, and also the FDA, when there's a problem that is intractable, that is an urgent problem, they will approve studies that are not fully double-blind, that are not fully placebo-controlled, where there is so-called functional unblinding. That's a term they use. Normally you have a blind, double blind, and then there's this called functional unblinding, when the patients can detect whether they're getting the placebo or the active ingredients. So I
Right.
think there was a real displaced and logic on the part of the committee, but as they had their hearing and as they talked about things, there was kind of a group think that emerged that, oh, if it was only the functional unblinding, that would be one thing. But now we have that Lykos didn't list pleasure or euphoria as part of abuse, and then there was this unfortunate episode where one of the therapists had ethical transgressions, which unfortunately happens in medicine, happens in research, and it's very unfortunate that it happened. But yet Lykos took decisive action, and in any other, I think in other studies this wouldn't have disqualified it, but this committee said, oh, there's so many things that are wrong, we're going to vote against approval.
Yeah. Um, it felt like a set of very disingenuous critiques, yeah, given the close partnership with the FDA, like you were talking about before. It's interesting that we've landed here. um,
Right.
with all of the decades of work, the close partnership with the regulating body, and um, no. So here's one thing that I get stuck on, and it's the suicide rate for veterans being just an easy one to land on, because I know the number. I don't really understand the average daily suicide count for America, but somewhere between 22 to 45 veteran suicides daily. And this seems to be a drug that can really help that in a lot of cases. And um, there didn't seem to be any kind of calculation from the advisory committee, given this kind of lack of treatments that are super helpful and effective in a shortish period of time, and that crisis and how safe and effective the MAPS treatment looked. So that's something that really kind of bothered me. But I don't think the regulatory authority is supposed to take real world scenarios into account necessarily, right? Or how do you see that?
No, I do think they do take it into account, because when I read these studies, let's say there's a very serious condition, some kind of cancer or some kind of blood clotting disorder, and then there's a study that doesn't meet the full spectrum because it's hard to run that kind of study. It would take years. It would take too much money. They do approve drugs based on less than full stellar studies. They regularly do that. And I think, fingers crossed, when I said, I think they're going to kick the can down the road, figure out a way. They're not supposed to on one level, because this has breakthrough status, so a timetable was set up. But I believe they'll figure out a way, fingers crossed, not to turn it down and mandate another full phase 3 study, which can again take millions of dollars, to perform, and months, if not years, to perform, or definitely several years to perform, most likely. That they will somehow create a set of tasks for Lykos to accomplish that are more doable in a shorter period of time, and that will satisfy the critics, and it will also take pressure off them from the veterans groups and the congressional concern that this problem is being neglected, by the FDA. Of note is that Australia, in about a year ago, looking at the data that was available then, said, we want this available now to our population, and we're going to designate a group of psychiatrists who are, trained in using this, and we're going to allow its use. So they are doing that as we speak, or about to do it, based on the regulatory, situation there. Also, in the Netherlands, a very high-level government appointed commission was assembled last year, and they just issued their report in June, and they were asked a couple questions. Should MDMA be completely legalized, for the general population to purchase and use? That was one question. And the second question is, should this be made available in a therapeutic setting? And they said no to the first one. They said, no, we don't think, Dutch society is ready. There's a large illicit, manufacturing industry, so to speak, and we're not ready to recommend that, But we are very much ready to recommend therapeutic use. In fact, they issued a mandate to the Dutch government that said, we, highly recommend that you make this available as soon as possible in a therapeutic setting. So that just came out in June. I pointed that out to the FDA. I know the FDA is not necessarily supposed to take other countries, bodies as full arguments for their work, but I'm hoping that, given that that they will not create many year delays in having MDMA available to the American people.
Mm. When you think about this particular intervention, what do you think the next best intervention is for something like treatment-resistant PTSD?
Well, what we have now, of course, is ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, which it's so fascinating how the American drug regulatory system works, in that, ketamine was FDA approved in about 40 plus years ago as a anesthetic drug to put people to sleep, to have surgery. It was quickly repurposed as a battlefield, even in the Vietnam War, drug for both pain relief, relief of the pain of burns, things like that. And then in the last 10, 15 years, doctors who treat severe pain found that it was invaluable to use both in the hospitals and outpatient in different forms. And then the psychiatrist discovered that an intravenous infusion of ketamine lifted suicidal depression within a matter of hours, that the drug wore off. So it became, but because it was FDA approved for general anesthesia, the law allowed it to be used off-label in these multiple different purposes. And those who were familiar with psychedelics realized that there was this window where we could use the ketamine in a way that was safe, that did not produce full anesthesia, but produced an altered state of consciousness that had psychedelic qualities to it. So ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, I think, is a valuable tool. I do think it it sort of has escaped complete, in certain areas, it has escaped responsible use and has become too easily available. And it does have, and for a small minority, but a significant minority of people who are exposed to it, it can be a slippery slope to an addictive process. And like, we in our medical practice, are faced with some people with ketamine use disorder or ketamine addiction. So ketamine is a nice thing we have currently, that we would love to have an additional tool in MDMA. In our field of opiate addiction and chronic pain, which PTSD patients often have one or the other, we find this drug buprenorphine, if used wisely, to be very, very promising and underutilized. So I'm accustomed to a world where we have these very useful drugs, even that are legal to use, but are strongly underutilized because of stigma, because of lack of training, because they're not the biggest money makers for big pharma at the current time. And so my experience with buprenorphine is something I did bring to the FDA in my letter, in that buprenorphine was discovered in the 60s, the late 60s, and it wasn't FDA approved until around 1981, when it was approved as an injection for pain. So because it was FDA approved as an injection for pain, back in the 90s, we started to use it for, in a different form, off-label, in a form where you could suck on a lozenge and get this buprenorphine. And we used it for pain, but we also, if the patient had addiction, we used it for addiction. Even like 10 years before the FDA finally formally approved it for addiction, which was not till 2002. So I went through this whole process with buprenorphine of trying to use it legally, but off-label. And finally, once it was approved for addiction, it really took off and has become much more available. And yet it still is underutilized. Still 8 out of 10 people with opiate addiction don't have access to it because the public health structure hasn't adapted. Addiction is stigmatized. And I feel PTSD in its own way is stigmatized, even though we all talk about it. I think people with PTSD, the veterans, the first responders, or just people who've had sexual trauma or early age trauma, although there's lip service to them having a real illness, there's not a real societal commitment to really bring these people out from their suffering. And then combine this with MDMA, which has a reputation as a party drug, a rave drug. There was misinformation for decades that it caused neurological problems, which again have never truly been documented in long-term sequela kind of studies. So I found that there was a connection between buprenorphine, but now we have buprenorphine, and it's been one of the most helpful public health victories, of the, I call it a private public regulatory partnership between a private company that invented it and then public entities taking up the baton and funding studies and getting it out there to people with addiction, and then finally the FDA regulatory system approving it. And it took time, it took too much time, but ultimately we had this victory. And I think that same victory can happen with MDMA, and I'm hoping that the FDA figures out a way to do it sooner rather than later in terms of their decision this week.
Yeah, I really am hopeful. And really just hope we can get this to people soon at a pretty big scale. Any commentary around insurance or reimbursement and how that might flow? That's one of the people's largest concerns when they hear about this.
Yes. Well, there's something that we have found in treating addiction in our practice, is that that there's sometimes if you invest at the front end, of the process of addiction, you help people with programs, you help people with residential programs or outpatient programs. It can be expensive, in the short run. But then when you have recovery, you have long-term benefits to society and even benefits to the insurance industry. So I do believe that the costs of the MDMA therapy in the short run to the insurance industry might look like there will be an outlay needed for like the 6 months, that maybe these 3 sessions that the FDA is evaluating. Lykos had a system of 3 different sessions with multiple integration sessions and preparation sessions. That it could look to the insurance company like it's a big expense, but then at the end of the day, you have a higher rate of resolution of the PTSD. You have lower suicide attempts. You have lower addiction rates to other drugs that can be very expensive. So that again, we talked earlier, this ICERS organization appeared to be trying to protect the insurance industry maybe from this drug being approved, because it would entail expense, but in the long run, society would benefit. So there might be the need for, again, public-private partnerships and need for political support for this kind of thing, so that Medicare will pay for it, so that Medi-Cal will pay for it, so that regular commercial insurance will pay for it. And I think obviously that's the way to go, because otherwise it would just be a little bit like currently the Oregon Psilocybin Authority, which is still primarily privately financed, and middle class people, low income people cannot afford it at the current time.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that. I've heard some really optimistic things about inclusion in healthcare plans, so I'm excited to see how that develops. And it looks really possible that we'll get really robust reimbursements. And you're right. It's just how do we tell that larger economic story and get them to buy in? Because I think it's clear that we're decreasing their costs if we help these really ill people get a bunch better.
Yeah. I should make the comment that one of the things I was around when, let's say, Prozac was first introduced in the late 1980s, and it made a big splash, as you probably know. And then a series and the reason it made a big splash is it helped people feel better relatively quickly, within a couple of weeks. And it also helped people who had like painful social anxiety, who had never felt comfortable just in life, and then following Prozac came Zoloft, Paxil, Celexa, Lexapro, Cymbalta, Effexor, but what we've noticed is those drugs, often the benefits only last for a limited period of time, but then people get stuck on the drug. Then withdrawing the drug gets very complicated. And in fact, the old symptoms come back. And so there's a concern that they need to be on these drugs long term. And I believe these drugs have created, in addition to the benefit that they've done, they've created a huge amount of detriment to the population, because in our practice, where we treat addiction and we treat chronic pain that hasn't gone away, often the only way for us to really help our patients is to wean them off these SSRI, SNRI drugs. And there's other categories of drugs that are a little bit like that sometimes help quite a bit in the short run, but then if they're kept on, they create side effects, weight gain, diabetes, and people never really fully naturally emerging in a healthy way. So that the system is really primed now for the emergence of psychedelics, a kind of a short-term intervention that creates neuroplasticity in the system, that changes some of the neural circuits. And so that's why they're, I think, so important to to nurture right now. My other belief system is that they change the sort of the epistemology. They change the worldview, and that's what's needed in the greater world too. We need many people to change their worldview of themselves, their relationship to nature. And I'm still fascinated with this emergence of psychedelics, like at the same time that we have, let's say, a significant escalation of the nuclear arms race, of nuclear dangers, and dating back to work that Sasha Shulgin did, where he said, why do I do what I did? Why do I do what I do? He was impressed that in in December of 1942, when the atomic bomb was created, the nuclear chain reaction, or not the bomb itself, but the scientific steps that led, that preceded only by 3 months of Albert Hofmann's discovery of the psychedelic properties of LSD in April of 1943. And with the Oppenheimer film having become a blockbuster success, there's other films coming out, there's other books coming out on the danger of nuclear war. There's actually an international treaty which is not talked about in the United States, but it's called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's a United Nations treaty. There's 70 nations ratified the treaty, including New Zealand, including Austria, and there's sympathetic observers from the Netherlands and from Belgium. So and Ireland is a ratifier too of the treaty. So we actually have these two movements coming up, and of course, climate change movement too. So we have these sort of positive things trying to emerge together, and I think they can reverberate with each other to hopefully save our civilization and our species. So I have this optimistic view that I want to keep reminding myself of, and also the people I care about in my practice, as well as your audience too, Joe.
All right. Well, thank you so much for all of this. I'm hopeful we can get you on the podcast so we can dig deeper into this nuclear conversation and some of the history there, because there's some really interesting stuff. And
Right.
I appreciate the reflections with Sasha's insights. I think he's one of the top minds we've had. He makes my top 3 psychedelic intellect list.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know who's top.
Yeah. It
right.
was. Yeah. Thank you very much, Joe, for the opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you for being here, and can't wait to do more.
Okay. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.